Oh, ladies and gents, it is that time of year, finally. The World Championship just a couple of weeks away. We've got the 16 guaranteed Cs to be at the Crucible. Now it's just to find out who are going to be the 16 players to join them. The qualifiers draw has been made, and the purpose of this video, and unfortunately it's going to be quite a long video, I can already feel it, is to go through the 16 sections of the qualifying draw. I'm going to have a look at the favourites to qualify from each section. I'm going to look at potential underdogs. And ultimately, I'm going to try and predict all 16 qualifiers. Quite frankly, that's impossible. I don't think anyone in the history of snooker has ever correctly predicted all 16 qualifiers. I think if you get more than 10, I think you've done a pretty good effort. And I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts as well. You know, in the comments, let me know who are your 16 qualifiers. Who are your surprise packages? Who are your players to look out for? There are things that I have to kind of keep in mind when making this video. And I've kind of picked out three key aspects. One, there's always a big hitter that doesn't make it. Last year, Barry Hawkins was heavily favoured to qualify. He didn't. There's been years in the past where Joe Perry's gone in, didn't make it. Ryan Day's had really good seasons, not made it. So the big hitters are not guaranteed to go through, and there are a lot of big hitters in the World Championship draw this year. Then you've also got surprise packages, you know, underdog stories, players you just never really consider as a prospect to qualify, come out completely of left field and make it to the Crucible. I need to keep that in mind as well. And then finally, there are always debutantes. Over the past 5 years, the average number of debutantes at the Crucible is 3, well, just under 3. So, as well as the surprise packages, there's always going to be debutantes as well. So, keeping all of that in mind, I've tried to, accurately as possible, predict how I think the events are going to unfold over the next sort of week and a half at the World Championship qualifiers. So if we just go straight into section 1, we start with Jack Lazowski. Perhaps surprising to a lot of people that he's here in the qualifiers. He's 17th in the rankings. He missed out on a top 16 place by about £8,000. And it's the first time since 2018 that Jack's been in the qualifiers. Every year since 2019, he's been a seed at the Crucible. And sort of part and parcel of the reason why he's here is the fact that he's really struggled since the turn of the year, only winning 4 matches in 2024. Something I praise him a lot about is his ability to bounce back, you know, every time after a disappointment. So many times he gets to a quarterfinal, a semi-final, playing really well, and then falls short at the worst possible time. But he's always been able to bounce back, and that's why he's always been a top 16 player. But that bounce back ability has kind of drifted away from him at the last part of this season. So he's here and he's in a pretty brutal section of the draw, it has to be said. If we start right at the beginning, you've got Martin Gould and Jimmy Wright playing against each other in the first round. Martin Gould, unfortunately, it kind of feels like his career is heading towards being over, and it's been completely blighted by health issues, both mental and physical. A previous ranking event winner. He's been in the top 16 multiple times. You know, a hugely popular player, a hugely admirable player. And it's really unfortunate that health issues have kind of pushed him towards the brink of falling off tour. He's 81st in the world. Obviously, you need to be in the top 64 to maintain your tour card. So it looks very likely that he's going to drop off. And that is a real shame. You know, snooker's at a loss if Martin Gould drops off this season. He plays Jimmy White, you know, the fan favourite. Just 2 wins for Jimmy this season. Although if you're a Jimmy White fan and you're trying to find any positive you can, take comfort in the fact that one of his 2 wins this season came against Jimmy Robertson, another man that is in this section of the draw. Jimmy's not qualified since 2006. You kind of feel like he may never qualify again. But, you know, he absolutely loves the sport and, you know, no one's going to begrudge him a chance at playing at the qualifiers. At least he does, unlike some. Stephen Hendry. Then also in this draw, we've got Liu Honghao. And I'm going to ask you to really look at Liu as a bit of an underdog story here. He got to the semi-finals at the English Open earlier this season. And if you look at some of his results, he's beaten Sean Murphy twice, he's beaten Ding Junhui, and he's also beaten Mark Williams. Some very big scalps. And to make a semi-final on your first season on tour is very, very impressive. So he's going to come into this qualifiers with arguably absolutely nothing to lose. There's going to be no pressure on him, and perhaps all to gain. So Jack Lisowski is going to really have to be on it in that match. And then in the other section of the draw, there are two sort of big hitters there as well. Jimmy Robertson, he's made the Crucible 5 times, but never won a match at the Crucible. But 5 times tells you that he knows how to get over the line at the qualifiers. And then Matthew Stevens, another living legend in this section of the draw, twice a Crucible finalist. And yeah, the match between Jimmy and Matthew Stevens, with all due respect to Ryan Thomason and Liam Davies, I don't see either of them challenging. So Jimmy Robertson and Matthew Stevens will be a really good match. But as for my predicted winner of this section, I'm going to take a slight punt, and I'm already just going to go straight in there and think of a surprise package. I don't think that Jack Lisowski's going to make it. I think he could potentially lose to Lu Honghao, and lose to player that I'm going to back to qualify. I've got Lu Honghao to beat Jimmy Robertson on Judgment Day. Going into section 2 now, and things look slightly more clear-cut for me here. Mark Joyce being at the Crucible before, losing to Ronnie O'Sullivan. Mark Davis has been there a plethora of times. I remember him beating John Higgins roughly 10 years ago. But to be quite frank, I'm not seeing anyone here challenging either Walden or Chepcheon-Nu. Ricky Walden is ranked 32 in the world, Chepcheon 33 in the world. So they are as close can be when it comes to the qualifiers. And they actually played each other in the final qualifying round last year. Ricky Walden won that 10-9. And if we look at their season so far, pretty underwhelming, particularly from Chepcheon-Nu. He's not got to the quarterfinal of any tournament this season. And it's so frustrating because we all know how talented Chepcheon is. He just has absolutely zero consistency. And that's why he really hasn't achieved in the game as much as his talent really should have led him to. And then even Walden, he's only reached one quarterfinal this season. And that was at the Welsh Open a couple of months ago. So yeah, I do think it's a straight shootout between those two. And in my head, I'd love to see Chepcheon-Nu qualifier. I think he's so fun to watch. And, he's not won a match at the Crucible yet. But, there's no form to help me pick him. And Walden's found maybe a little bit of form, the Welsh Open quarterfinal only being a few weeks ago. So for that reason, I'm going to back Ricky Walden to again beat Chepcheon-Nu on Judgment Day. And it's probably going to be close as well. Potentially another decider, but definitely something like 10-8, 10-7. Going swiftly into section 3. And this is headed up by Anthony McGill, the 25th ranked player. And if there's ever a player that just screams Crucible pedigree, it's Anthony McGill. Since making his debut in 2015, Anthony has made it back to the Crucible every single year since. Semi-finalist 4 years ago, he also has 3 other quarter-final appearances at the World Championship. And he's beaten players like Trump, O'Sullivan, Selby and Murphy. Just his game is tailor-made for the Crucible. The only problem for Anthony is he can't seem to perform anywhere else. Only one quarter-final appearance this season, and that's why he's never been able to push on. He's been in the top 16 before, and he has won a tournament before. But he's never been able to take his game to the next level, purely because consistency-wise, particularly in the shorter format, he can't do it as well as he can at the World Championship. But looking at this section of the draw, okay, you've got David Grayson there, been to the Crucible before, Dominic Dale, another sort of a legend of the game. But the main threat that I'm seeing here is He Guok Kwang. On his first season on tour, he's made a quarter-final, and he's also beaten players like Mark Williams, Barry Hawkins, Hussein Fafai and Kyron Wilson. So again, a real big plethora of big hitters that he's beaten there. The thing is, though, McGill is just so consistent at the World Championship. His record speaks for itself, and I'm not convinced over a best of 19 there's any players in this section that makes me think twice about him qualifying. So for me, it's going to be Anthony McGill to beat David Grace. Next up, it's my boy, Neil Robertson. Still haven't quite come to the terms of the fact that he's in the qualifiers. But that's where he is, 25th currently in the rankings. And it's the first time Neil's been at the qualifiers since 2006. Neil made his debut in 2005 and he's been at the Crucible every year since. But that record is under serious threat here. And look, we're going to have a look at players in here that might beat Neil. And it's not a straightforward section, but it's also not the worst section in the world either. If we look at Chadra, he's picked up some impressive wins in his debut season, beating Luke Brissell, Anthony McGill, and he's also twice beaten Stuart Bingham. So, he'll fancy himself maybe as a little bit of an underdog story there. Zach Surety never made it to the Crucible, but he did make a 147 at the World Open a couple of weeks ago. But I do expect Neil Robertson to beat either of those two. And if we're looking at main threats to Neil Robertson, I think a lot of people will look at Jamie Jones, a man who's qualified for the World Championship 5 times, including making a quarterfinal on his debut in 2012. Neil's also played Jamie at the 2015 World Championships, a match that he won 10-2. But outside of Jamie Jones, I'm actually looking at Shuzi as a slight outside bet, a man who's beaten Sean Murphy and Mark Selby this season. And he'll definitely give Jamie Jones a stern test in that penultimate qualifying round. As for Neil, though, the main hope is that he's able to deal with the Crucible, the qualifiers pressure. This is going to be uncharted territory for him. Like I say, 2006 was his last time at the qualifiers. So he's probably going to have forgotten what it's like to play there under these kind of conditions. But that semi-final at the World Open has just inspired me a little bit to believe that he can qualify. And I can't go against him. I really can't. So ultimately, I'm going to go... This isn't just my heart talking, this is my head as well. I think Neil will qualify, and I have him down to beat C on Judgment Day. Now we go into section 5, and this is actually a pretty tasty section. It's headed up by Zhao Yulong, the 21st ranked player. But there's 4 men in this section who have made the Crucible before. You've got James Cahill, who obviously famously beat Ronnie O'Sullivan in 2019, but in truth has never really kicked on in his career since that win. Jamie Clark, he's qualified twice before, and he did beat Mark Allen on his debut. And then he went and played Anthony McGill in the second round, and there was a sort of a bit of feistiness between the pair in that match. You've also got Jack Jones. He made his debut last year where he beat Hawkins to qualify, and then he went on to beat Ali Carter and Neil Robertson at the venue. So he'll definitely have really good memories of last year. And then going back to Zhao, he's also qualified twice before, and just like Clark, he beat Mark Allen in the first round in 2019. So out of those 4, they all know how to do it, and they all know how to do it very recently as well. But out of the 4, Zhao has had by far the better season, with 1 semi-final appearance and 2 quarterfinals, including a quarterfinal at the UK Championship. But I'm actually going to go for Jamie Clark here. I think he quite looks at home in the longer format, and although he's not had a convincing season, I fancy him to come good next week. So my prediction is Jamie Clark to beat Zhao Yulong on Judgment Day. Section 6, the big player here is Stephen Maguire, another big hitter. Currently ranks 28th in the world, one of the lowest he's ever been. He's another player with plenty of experience when it comes to the World Championship qualifiers. In fact, last year was the first time since 2003 that Stephen Maguire wasn't at the Crucible, so I'm sure he will be itching to get back there this year. But again, there are potential banana skins throughout this section. Ashley Hugehill, he qualified a couple of seasons ago, and he definitely has a style of game that could irritate Maguire if Steven doesn't stamp his authority on the game early. You've also got Michael White. He's another man to have played at the Crucible, and he's also reached the quarterfinals there. Whilst Yuan Xijun has never made it before, so he could be a pick. If you're looking for a potential debutant, he could definitely be worth a bit of a punt. The problem is, looking at this section, is no players really coming into this tournament in any kind of form. And for that reason, I can only really go on experience. And when it comes to experience, Stephen Maguire just has plenty compared to everyone else. And I'm going to back that. I'm going to back Stephen to use his experience to get through. So my prediction is Stephen Maguire to beat Michael White on Judgment Day. Now we go into section 7, and this is a section headed up by Stuart Bingham. And Stuart is currently 29th in the world. And another player, just like Maguire, just like Robertson, a player that has not been this low in the rankings for quite a while. And if you're a Stuart Bingham fan, there's plenty of cause to be concerned, really. Looking at this season, he's only been to one quarterfinal. And then if you look at last season, he also reached one quarterfinal. So his decline has not just come out of nowhere, it has been dropping for now 2 years. He's a player that's been at the Crucible every year since 2011, and of course won it in 2015. But that is a run that he could potentially see come to an end this year. And again, plenty of experience is in this draw. Stuart Carrington, he is a man who has qualified for the World Championships 3 times before, although we've seen very little of him recently. Liam Highfield is another player to have qualified 3 times. And then you have arguably the favourite for this section, and that's Elliot Slesser, who's qualified for the World Championship twice before. Now, the reason I say Elliot Slesser is favourite, or at least favourite in my eyes, is because he's made a semi-final this season in Wales, and also got to the quarterfinal in China a couple of weeks ago. So in terms of form, he's bang on it and is head and shoulders above the rest of the players in this section. I would have liked to have punted actually for Ollie Lyons, because I find it absolutely criminal that Ollie has never made it to the Crucible before. But again, it's been a very lacklustre season from him, and he's just never really looked like converting his obvious talent into anything more, and that's a real shame for me. He could be potentially a surprise, but there's nothing form-wise that makes me think that he could go all the way. So therefore, I am quietly confident of Elliot Slesser getting through, and I've got him down to beat Stuart Bingham to qualify. Moving straight into section 8, and this is headed up by Chris Wakelin, who is currently ranked 20th in the world, which is a career best for him. Finalist in Northern Ireland this season. He's made it to the Crucible 3 times before, including taking Judd Trump to a decider on his debut, and I think he was something like 7-3 or 8-3 down in that match. But the one thing that Chris hasn't done, he hasn't won a match at the Crucible, and I'm sure he'll be really liking to put that right this year. Lurking around in this section of the draw, you've got the European trio of Alexander Ersenbacher, you've got Boyko, and Lucas Kleck is present there as well. Out of those 3, only Ersenbacher has qualified before, making his one and only appearance at the Crucible back in 2020. And as much as I'm sure Luca Brussel's win at the World Championship last season would have spurred all European players on, I'm not convinced that any of those 3 have enough in them to challenge here. You've got veteran Anthony Hamilton in the draw, and it might surprise some people that he's actually not been at the Crucible since 2008. That certainly surprised me when I was doing my research into this video. Of course, he did qualify for the World Championship back in 2020, but that was when the tournament was obviously heavily impacted by COVID. And after qualifying, he was told that fans would be in the venue, which he wasn't aware of until the day before the tournament started. So he withdrew from the tournament fairly controversially. I mean, I completely understood his decision. Some of us didn't. But yeah, withdrew due to COVID reasons. So even though he qualified, he's not been at the venue since 2008. And then you've got Robbie Williams, a man that's also qualified 3 times. And he qualified in 3 consecutive seasons between 2014 and 2016. But he's not made it back since. A very steady player. Actually not really a player that I would see accustomed to the World Championship. But obviously for that period between 2014 and 2016, something obviously clicked. But again, similar to other sections, there's only one player here who's in any kind of form this season, and that's Chris Wakelin. So my prediction is Wakelin to beat Williams on Judgment Day. We're into section 9 now. We're over halfway through. Crikey, this really is long. This section is headed up by Hussein Fafai, 19th in the rankings. And fans of Hussein, I'm going to get to your star boy in a minute. But just looking at this draw, I'm going to circle Marco Fu here as a very, very tempting outside bet. This is his first time back on tour for a few years. Like a lot of the Asian players, COVID really affected him. And as a man that lives out in Hong Kong, he wasn't able to come back to the UK and to Europe to play in the majority of events. So on a personal note, obviously I'm a huge Neil Robertson fan, but I'm always happy when Marco Fu does well. And like I say, he's a very tempting outside bet. He's beaten Mark Selby and Stuart Bingham this season on his return to the professional circuit. And if you look at his opening 2 matches, you probably heavily favour him to beat Bipat. And then going against Ken Doherty, I mean, Ken, I don't think he's really been picking up the results as he used to be. And I'd favour Marco to beat him as well. Question is, can Marco beat Hussein Fafai? And that's a real shame for me, because I think in a lot of other sections of this draw, Marco Fu could really have a good crack at going all the way. Problem is, Hussein, we know what he's about. Beat Ding last year. You kind of feel like Hussein is on the verge of becoming a top 16 player and potentially becoming a tournament winner. Obviously beat O'Sullivan at the World Open in China a couple of weeks ago as well. I think Marco can give Hussein a very, very tough game. And if you're looking for an outside bet, I think Marco Fu is something like 9-2 to qualify. I certainly would put a couple of pounds on him. But there's other players in this draw as well. You've got Sam Craigie, semi-finalist at the German Masters this year. And he's also qualified once before in 2021. And then you've got Fan, who's made 2 quarterfinals this season, a very impressive season for him. And he qualified last season to make his debut. So again, even if Hussein gets past the Marco Fu test, 2 very difficult players will stand in front of him in Judgment Day. I keep saying it. I really do. I really, really want to back Marco. But my head is just saying Hussein is going to be too much for him. Maybe if Marco had more match experience, I think Marco could win. But it is that fact that it's just more match experience, which leads me to believe that Fafai will beat Marco. And then I've got Fafai to beat Fan on Judgment Day to become the 9th player to qualify. Now if we go into the next section, it's a section headed up by Joe O'Connor. He's 30th in the rankings, and he's mainly there thanks to last season. He had a pretty good season last season, his best result making the final of the Scottish Open where he lost to Gary Wilson. But following up that really successful season, he's had an equally very poor season this term. No appearances at all in the last 16 of any event, which is really poor, especially for a player ranked inside the top 32. And he's never qualified for the World Championship before. And, I'd really like to see him as a potential debutant, but that's a worry, how poor his season's been. Looking elsewhere in this draw, you've got Matt Selt, and he has the most Crucible appearances of anyone in this section, qualifying 4 times before. But again, he's a player that's qualified a load of times but never actually won a match at the Crucible. Looking at his season, he reached a quarterfinal earlier, and he's also been beaten by Judd Trump a couple of times when really looking dangerous and really looking like he might kick on in tournaments. And if we're looking at this section, I would probably say Matt Selt is easily the odds-on favourite to qualify. But I'm actually going to pick my second Crucible debutant from this section, and that player is Julien Leclerc. He's a man that all the way back at the start of the season I picked as one of my 5 players to watch, and I think he is really exciting. And I think even if he doesn't stay on tour at the end of next season, I think he's a man that does have a future in the game. He's had a reasonably decent debut season on tour, and although the highest seeds in this section, Joe O'Connor and Matt Selt, are obviously good and obviously big threats, on paper, I don't think you would say this is the worst section in the draw for an underdog to come from. And it's for that reason why I am backing there to be an underdog story here. And Julien Leclerc, who knows? I think he can beat O'Connor. Matt Selt, very difficult to beat, especially on Judgment Day. He's been there, he's done that. And as well, so many times he's reached the Crucible, I'm sure he'd want to reach the Crucible and win. Even though, going back to Matt Selt briefly, he did qualify last year and narrowly lost to Mark Selby 10-8. But yeah, even though Matt Selt is the favourite, I am going to plump for Julien Leclerc to qualify. God, if you're still watching this and tolerating my dull voice for the past, 25, 26 minutes, I'm very impressed. But we're into section 11 now. We're getting towards the end, and it's a section headed up by Pang Jung-soo, 27th in the world, qualified last year and played O'Sullivan on his debut. Losing, I think he lost that match 10-7, even though at some point he was like 9-3 behind. So he did show what he can do towards the end of that match. Unfortunately, though, done very little of note this season, not got past the last 16. So he's not, again, been able to push on. Martin O'Donnell is a player that has had a decent season, though. Finalist at the Welsh Open this season. But surprisingly, I find it surprising anyway, Martin's not qualified for the World Championship before in 10 attempts. So he could be another huge contender to be a debutant this year. But looking elsewhere, Chow Yu-peng, he's another man who's had a pretty good season in truth. Finalist at the Snooker Shootout. I know the Snooker Shootout shouldn't be a ranking event, and it's only one frame and it's only 10 minutes, blah, 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 blah. But, still made the final. And he's also made it to the semi-finals of the World Grand Prix. Looking at his World Championship record, he made it to the Crucible back in 2012 for his debut. And he famously on that debut beat Mark Allen. That match where Mark Allen potted the black and then potted the white at the same time to lose the match, I think 10-6. And then came into his press conference with black tape over his mouth and calling all Chinese players cheats. Something that I'm sure Mark deeply regrets and doesn't want to be reminded about. But going back to Chow Yu-peng, obviously since making that debut in 2012, he's never got back to the World Championship since. And obviously there have been off-table dramas that have kind of impacted that. So he'll be itching to get back to the World Championship. But as predictions go, I'm going to go for yet another debutant. I've got my third debutant in the bag. I said there needed to be 3. I've got it. Martin O'Donnell, again, can't believe he's never made it before. He is my pick to beat Pang Jung-soo on Judgment Day to make his debut. Section 12, headed up by Noppon Sankham, who is 22nd in the world rankings. Finalist at the Scottish Open this season, and a player who does have plenty of recent World Championship pedigree. Looking at his record, he's qualified 4 times before. He made his debut in 2017 where he got heavily beaten by Neil Robertson. But in his appearances since then, he has been very, very impressive indeed. He's beaten Sean Murphy. he's beaten Luca Bracel, and I believe it was 2020. He took Mark Selby to a decider in the last 16 a few years back. Plenty, like I say, World Championship pedigree, and a player who is again sort of knocking on the door of potentially climbing the ladder into the top 16, potentially climbing the ladder to win a tournament, and a player that I'm incredibly impressed by. You know, when everyone talks about talents emerging from Thailand, a lot of people talk about Tepchayorn, but I've always been a firm believer that Noppon Sankam has been the more likely to do bigger things in the game, just because he's more solid all round. He might not be as exciting and free-flowing as Tepchayorn, but he makes far less mistakes and he is far more consistent, you know, regularly appearing in the ITV events where you've got to be in the top 32, top 16 on the 1 year list. But in this section, it's pretty brutal because you've also got Jackson Page, someone who, if this draw was made a month ago, I wouldn't really be giving Jackson Page much comment. But finally, he made a bit of a run at the World Open in China a couple of weeks ago, made the semi-finals, losing to Judd Trump. And as his Crucible record go, he made his debut 2 years ago, where he also beat Barry Hawkins in the first round. And, you know, he could be about to turn a very, very poor season into a fairly memorable one. But looking at, if there's anyone that can stop a Noppon v Page Judgment Day match, which seems very likely, you've got Fergal O'Brien, who's retiring at the end of the season. Quarter-finalist at the Crucible in 2000, but he's not qualified since 2017, and he's not really done a lot this season, winning 7 matches in total. Could there be a fairy tale finish to finish his career and reach the Crucible? It would be magic for him if he can, but unfortunately I think there's too many strong players in this section. You've got Rhiannon Evans, the most successful female player. She's aiming to become the first woman to qualify, as are players like Baipat and Baiyu Liu. She has a couple of winnable matches, particularly early on, but can I see her getting past Noppon Sankam? Unfortunately not. And then there's Graham Dott, and you know, in terms of the best players or best performances at a World Championship, Graham Dott is, of course, head and shoulders above the rest. Crucible winner in 2006. He's also been a runner-up at the World Championship in 2004 and 2010. And there was a time where he used to be my favourite to qualify every single year. But actually, he hasn't made it back to the Crucible since 2019. And before that, he had failed to reach the Crucible once from about 2002 to 2019. And actually looking at his rankings, he currently sits 54th in the world. So his career is perilously starting to slide away. He's always a threat, of course he is. But unfortunately, he's not the same player anymore. And I don't see him beating one or both of the likes of Noppon and Page. So my Judgment Day match is definitely Sankam against Jackson Page. Winner of that, toss of a coin. Jackson Page was brutal in his scoring at the World Open and could easily blow Noppon away. As good as Noppon is, I think if there's a player likely to win by a higher margin, I think it's Jackson. But that being said, with all the pressure that's around the World Championship qualifiers, my prediction is Noppon Sankam to beat Jackson Page. Section 13 now, and you've got Si Jiahui, who is the biggest seed in this section, 23rd in the world, and obviously famously reached the semi-finals last year. Can you believe it's almost been a year since he was 14-5 up on Luca Bracel, coasting towards a World Championship final on his Crucible debut, before somehow letting that lead slip and losing to the eventual winner. And he'll obviously be desperate to get back and not only qualify, but hopefully try and right the wrongs of 12 months ago. Also in this section, there's 2 teenagers, Stan Moody 17 years old. Ben Mertens, 19 years old. And both players are sort of bigged up to have big futures in the game. Neither of them qualified before. And if you can qualify for the World Championship in your teens, especially in this day and age where, players are getting better and better the older they get, it would be a massive achievement for either of them. If I was to stick my neck out, I'd say Stan Moody would be the slightly more likely of the two to qualify. But ultimately, I'm not too sure either of them will do. Although I definitely fancy Stan Moody to win his first match. And you've also got in this draw Rui Yiza. He qualified last season as well, making his debut, lost to Neil Robertson. Again, though, I've said this so many times in this video about different players that had good seasons last season who have just not been able to kick on. And that's what really separates players from sort of one-trick ponies or players that have real futures in the game. Ultimately, though, as much as I'd like to think one of the teenagers could get through to Judgment Day, I do think this is between C and Rui Yiza. And my money is on Si Jiawei to qualify again, beating Rui on Judgment Day. Section 14, Michael Holt, off tour for 2 years. And look, call me crazy, considering the fact that he's been off tour for a couple of years. But this potentially is a winnable section here. He's, made the Crucible on multiple occasions before. He's beaten Neil Robertson at the Crucible. Such a likeable guy, such a really good player. It was a travesty that he ever fell off tour in the first place. He's been pretty open that mentality-wise is what let him down, because technique-wise and in terms of talent, he's an unbelievable player. There's a season where I think he beat O'Sullivan 3 times in one season. Can he get through here? He would have to win 4 matches, but I might back him, It's a very winnable section, like I say. I'm personally excited to see what the Women's World Champion, I should say, Bayu Liu can do. I think she could beat Jensen Kendrick, but I'm really excited to see what she does on the professional circuit. She's got her first full season next season. Such a talent, such a scorer. Big opportunity for her to show what she can do to maybe perhaps an audience that don't regularly keep an eye on the women's game. As the top seed, Liu Haoshan, he's 26th in the world. He's qualified for the World Championship 3 times, including a run to the last 16 on his debut. And you've got Jordan Brown in here as well, the former Welsh Open winner. He's also qualified once before, and he also has a semi-final appearance to his name this season at the International Championship. So many big names. But yeah, like call me crazy, but I'm going to go for Michael Holt. I know he won't be a debutant, but he would definitely be an underdog. To win 4 matches to qualify is a huge task. 40 frames just to get to the Crucible. But yeah, I can see it happening. So my pick here is Michael Holt. Now moving into the penultimate section. This is headed up by Dave Gilbert, 31st in the world. And just a single quarterfinal to his name this season. There's been a lot of off-table struggles with David Gilbert that he's openly expressed. And it's a real shame because, like me, I think the lion's share of snooker fans really warm to Dave and they really want him to do well. That semi-final that he had against John Higgins at the Crucible, I think everyone, other than the hardcore John Higgins fans, wanted Dave Gilbert to win it, and it was heartbreaking that he didn't manage to get over the line. He's fallen off a little bit, but in terms of his ability to qualify for the World Championship, that has remained very consistent. He last failed to qualify back in 2018, and like I say, he's a former semi-finalist in 2019. And really, this section looks like a bit of a two-way fight between him and Xiao Guidong. Xiao qualified 3 times before, but like I said, Dave Gilbert last failed to qualify in 2018. 2018 was the last time Xiao Guidong made it to the Crucible. 6 years, he'll be itching to get back. Semi-finalist at the British Open right at the beginning of this season, but he's not really done a whole lot since. If you're looking at potential underdogs in this section, Sanderson Lamb, perhaps. He's had a few good results this season, including a win over Neil Robertson right at the beginning of the season. But yeah, like I say, for me, this is a two-way street fight between Gilbert and Zhao. And I really like Gilbert, I really do. But unfortunately, my mind is saying I think Zhao Guodong might get over the line. Again, I think that would be a really good match, a really tight match. But my prediction is Zhao Guodong to qualify on Judgment Day. And that leads us to finally the final section of the draw. And what a section. You know, we started off with a really good section. We're finishing with a really good section as well. Ryan Day, 18th in the world. 14 appearances at the Crucible at the World Championships, including a best performance in 2012 when he got to the quarterfinals. As this season goes, not amazing. He's only reached one quarterfinal at the German Masters a couple of months ago, and on top of that, only one further last 16 appearance. So he's never really threatened to get into the top 16, but he's still very high, 18th in the world. And then on the other side, look at that, Joe Perry, 17 Crucible appearances, a former semi-finalist, multiple quarter-finalist, and I remember vividly that match in 2014 against Ronnie O'Sullivan, where it looked like he was really going to cause an upset. I think he was 11-9 up on Ronnie when Ronnie was the double defending champion. And O'Sullivan then just played four of the most unbelievable frames to come back and win a 13-11. The slight question for Joe Perry is, has he maybe fallen out of love with snooker? His form this season hasn't been fantastic. Only one last 16 appearance. Plenty of first round exits this season as well. It'll be a shame if he does retire because he's a fantastic player, but at the same time he could be a really good player, for a really good man for Neil Robertson to have in his corner. Also in this draw you've got Scott Donaldson. He's qualified twice before, and I always think Scott is a real threat at the World Championship qualifiers. Another player that's qualified before is Ashley Carty. He made his debut a few years ago. And you've got the experience of Peter Lynton there as well. So definitely, again, potential upsets. But again, I'm going to back the top two players of Day and Perry to meet on Judgment Day. Ordinarily, I think that would be a coin flip. But in terms of, like I say, both form and also the fact that I think Ryan Day is enjoying his snooker a little bit more than Joe, my prediction is Ryan Day to beat Joe Perry to qualify. And yeah, there we have it, guys. Here are my in full 16 selected qualifiers for this year's World Championship. 3 debutants, a few underdogs there, and plenty of big hitters. That there could be some really, really massive matchups. Imagine something like O'Sullivan against Robertson, or Anthony McGill against Judd Trump again. That there could be so many storylines. But that starts next Monday. I'm really looking forward to it. It's twitchy, it's always tense, it's always full of drama. I cannot wait for it to begin. I just love this time of year. If the World Championship is like Christmas, this is like opening door number 1 of your advent calendar. I cannot wait. As I say, let me know in the comments who you think are going to qualify. I'm always interested to see your thoughts. If you get more than 10, I will give you a hearty handshake. If you get 16 correct qualifiers, you can have my YouTube channel. There might only be 300 subscribers, but hey, I will give it to you because I'm simply just not at your level. But yeah, I'll be back. There's more videos for me to come over the next week or two relating to the World Championship. But until then, enjoy the snooker. And God, it's going to be such a feast over the next few weeks.